Hey, there was something we were talking about on the call about like shame and sex and all these different things that come about with sexuality. And what got brought up was homosexuality and more specifically homosexual men. And this is one of the best examples of what shame can do to sex and when you're free with it, what it can do with sex. And so when you look at, when you're hanging around with a lot of guys who are gay, man, there's in our culture today, there's a lot of freedom around it. And don't get me wrong, there's still a lot of judgment and there's still a lot of problems and all these different things. But what's so interesting is the sexual freedom and the openness that a gay man will have just to talk about sex, to be himself, to realize it's okay. If you're ever hanging out with a bunch of gay dudes and women, it only works in your favor, guys, because like, man, they do everything for you. They do everything for you. They bring sex on the table. They can get women engaged in all these different things. But we were talking about why that happens. And when you think about this, like being gay is never easy. First off, whenever you're going through puberty and you start to realize that you're having these feelings that are different from society, puberty alone for a heterosexual man who's quote unquote normal in our society, man, it's confusing enough. Man, it's so fucking like bizarre and crazy and all this sort of stuff. But imagine if you're doing something, and I'm not talking about the politically correct thing, but the culture says is wrong, or the culture sees as something that is off. And man, whether you like it or not, whether the political correctness says whatever, man, like it's going to be something that you're going to feel as abnormal when you're going through that time in your life. And when you go through that, and it's so confusing, and then at a certain point, you're able to get over it and process through it. And because right now our culture welcomes it a little bit more than it did 30, 40, 50 years ago, man, you have just a way bigger spectrum of what sexuality is and what it means, because you were forced to think about it so much in those formative years, all the way probably into your early 20s, to bring it up to your family, to hide it from your family, to have your first interactions and so on. They were a bigger breaking point that probably carried more shame, more guilt, more confusion that you had to make right. And this got brought up as well because like a lot of where I come from is from like a drug addict culture and those types of things. And, like when you're doing those, when you're in a mode of your life where that stuff's really taking over, whether it's like extreme anything. So any form of addiction, that could be narcotics, that could be gambling, that could be alcoholism, that could be all these different things. But when you're living a life of excess, you tend to get amazingly confused in that. And you don't need these things. Okay. So you could be going like, man, there's such great benefits to being a gay man. I think our culture is so fucked up right now that there are so many lost men and women who aren't gay that would be like, I'm going to try this out and challenge it. I'm going to fight club this, but and same thing to go with addiction. It was just one of the things that was a big thing that I have experienced and continue to experience of you chase this extreme. And if you're involved in drugs, especially narcotics, but also alcohol and really anything else, you're going to have like a lot of flavor towards your sex life, whether that's shame, whether that's less of it, whether that's trauma, but it's going to affect you on a deeper level and fuck you up. The beauty of it is if you can get a grip on that, get a grip with the addiction of whatever manifestation of it is you get this perspective where it's really amazing, where it's just such an awesome thing. And living on both sides of those things, it's awesome to look at. And so think about this. A gay man in the 1960s, what was he looked at? Think about the pain and the shame and the social problems and the what it did and the mental illness that it encouraged. And these were actually things that were said in the 60s and 50s and, all throughout history when it was less accepted, or in cultures where it was not accepted, of how bad that was. It was a disease. It was a way of thinking. These people do this, blah, 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 blah. And it compounded upon so much consistent mental illness and different problems that came into play. Now come the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, into the thousands, and it gets more and more acceptable. Gay culture has more of an outlet to talk to people. And God, man, it's a completely different thing. Don't get me wrong. There's still those problems. They still exist because there is that alienation. But when it's accepted, it becomes something totally different. Totally different. And we don't do that with sex. The same thing goes with that drug addict culture. Is like when you're in it and when you're in that mode of shame, you haven't processed it, and maybe you aren't doing crazy sex acts or whatever, but you've done them, and you have all this guilt wrapped around it. It's like, oh man, fuck, I'm a horrible person. I can't believe I did that. I'm never going to tell anybody that again. I promised myself I'd never end up in those situations. But I'll tell you this, man, when you're in situations when you are absolutely desperate, dude, it's totally normal to break the boundaries of your own morality. And I always say, like, you're going to gain the most value out of what you truly believe in when you break it and you have to cross back and work towards it again. Example of that is if you value honesty and you've never been challenged on honesty, you don't know honesty. But when you've taken the time to go like, man, I'm not going to be honest, I'm going to lie, I'm going to do this, and you even make that a lifestyle, and then you work back to get a level of honesty and what that is, man, you really, really know honesty. And so when those things happen, you know, with your sexuality, with your choices, and you're stuck in them, it's a living hell, man. It's a living hell. You know, things like suicide, things like self-hate, things like massive isolation, things like I can't talk to these people because, things like I'm different because, and the argument is so strong that you're not even questioning not to have that argument. You know, man, that is your reality. And it's really a prison of your mind. It's really a horrible thing. But when you can work past it, man, you have such a wealth and a perspective of life. And again, I'm not encouraging like to fight club lists and manufacture it and all this sort of stuff. That's just retarded. But life will present challenges in front of you. You know, if you're living life with ambition and being yourself, you don't need to push your comfort zone. You know, the challenges are going to normally and naturally come in front of you. And it's really like an amazing thing. But that's where you're going to learn that stuff, man. It's such an amazing thing. And, you know, I would advise you to explore more. Like, really look at gay men. Really look at the level of comfort that they may have with their sexuality, or there might be stuff that annoys you about their culture or whatever. But, like, really look at that. Their sexual behavior without the shame, when they've known shame at a certain point of their life, what did that bring? And so if you have sexual shame or those types of things, how can we get over that? How can we pass through it? Because, man, the liberation is just it's a completely different language that is right there waiting for you, and you'll have to work towards it. But, man, it's there to get. So, and to me, I always say there's no black and whites. That to me is a really black and white thing. You get past the shit, the guilt, the shame, the self-hate, the loathing of all the different stories that we have in our head and make it all right, man, it's really a cool thing.